couple of good presentations to get us started this morning. You know, for me, there's one take-home point from each presentation. The first one from Brian Richards is, you know, this is something to be concerned about, right? And then Dr. Landon, doing nothing is unacceptable. You know, those two take-home points for me are, I'm sure, the reason that everyone is in this room. Much is at stake. And we all, our respective agencies and NGOs and representing landowners want to know what we can do. We want to be on the cutting edge. It's why we're here to learn what the science tells us. In our next session that will begin at 10:30, we're gonna take a deeper dive into some of that science just to see what this science is telling us, so that we as agencies and those that are stewards of this resource can become better informed, and we can have the support of those out there knowing that it's based in science. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started with our next session. Our next presenter is Dr. Dave Edmunds. Dave is a research scientist working for Colorado State University in cooperation with the U.S. Geological Survey and Dr. Cameron Aldridge's lab. His career began at Virginia Tech, where he earned a BS in Wildlife Sciences in 2002, and he also learned valuable skills working on a graduate student's black bear research project. After graduation, he moved to Wyoming, where he worked as a field technician for 2 years studying black and grizzly bears, mountain lions, greater sage grouse, and white-tailed deer. Dave transitioned from a field technician to a master's degree student at the University of Wyoming and Department of Veterinary Sciences, working on his white-tailed deer project in 2004. He finished his Master of Science degree in 2008 and immediately began his doctoral work on the same project, which he finished in 2013. His master's and doctoral work focused on the ecology and epidemiology of chronic wasting disease in a high-prevalence white-tailed deer population in southeast Wyoming. His research interests include wildlife disease ecology, population dynamics, movement ecology, and population viability analyses. His current research is focused on greater sage grouse ecology and population dynamics. Would y'all please help me welcome Dr. Dave Edmunds.
Okay, well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for coming out today. I'd like to start by thanking the organizers of this symposium for inviting me down today to discuss my research focused on chronic wasting disease in white-tailed deer. Specifically, what I'll be talking about today are the population level impacts caused by chronic wasting disease in a high prevalence white-tailed deer population in southeastern Wyoming. I'd like to begin by acknowledging my co-authors on this work. Dr. Walt Cook's in the room, so thanks, Walt, for your assistance on this work. I'd also like to point out that Dr. Todd Cornish was my primary advisor and mentor during this work, and he helped see this work through to fruition, so I'd like to acknowledge him as well. We did publish this work, as Brian pointed out in his talk earlier today, and it's in PLOS One, which is an open access journal. So if you're interested in more details, the citation is at the bottom of the screen here, and PLOS One being an open access journal, you all have access to it. So if you have any more questions, you can find the information there. As Brian mentioned, there have been several studies investigating population level impacts of chronic wasting disease, and I'd like to start with just a quick review of a couple of those more meaningful studies. The first was done in a mule deer population in northeastern Colorado. What they documented was a high adult prevalence, particularly in males at 41% and females at 20%. And this high prevalence was associated with a 45% population decline between 1988 and 2006. They believe that chronic wasting disease was initially endemic in this population in the early 1980s. So that population decline occurred at the same time that CWD became common in this population. They believe that high prevalence lowered the overall adult survival rate to 0.72, and that is what was responsible for the population decline. Another study performed in northeastern Colorado looked at fawn recruitment and population growth. What they found was that recruitment was lower in CW positive does compared to CWD negative does. and that the finite rate of population growth, or lambda, was 0.97. Now, I was about to explain what lambda means, but Brian luckily did a really nice job, and so I won't have to do that right now, but a 0.97, if you recall, is related to a 3% annual population decline. However, in this case, the credible intervals overlapped 1. So in other words, this is not a statistically significant population decline. They can't say that it's declining any more than they could say that possibly it's increasing. They also found that the CWD effects on lambda were caused by increased mortality, and that lower annual recruitment had no effect on lowering lambda. And finally, there was a population study on elk in Rocky Mountain National Park. Brian also discussed this project. This is the population that had a lambda value of 1.0. What Brian didn't mention is that they had a CWD prevalence of 12.9%, which is actually quite high in elk. Rarely do we see the 30, 40, 50% prevalence in elk that you will see in white-tailed deer or mule deer in some of the high prevalence areas. They also predicted that lambda would fall below 1.0, or in other words, begin to decline when prevalence exceeded 13%. And this is because CWD in this population was, the mortality caused by CWD was additive, and it reduced lambda. Therefore, as more deer or more elk became CWD positive, more mortalities occurred, that population growth rate would fall below 1. So data certainly suggests that CWD has the potential to cause population declines at high CWD prevalence. However, those declines have not been definitively proven, or at least we didn't believe so. And so that's where our study came into play. And we hypothesized that demographic rates are altered by chronic wasting disease, and the population level effects are of large enough magnitude to lower lambda. We tested this hypothesis by meeting the following objectives, which were to determine the following for a high prevalence white-tailed deer population. We looked at demographic and disease indices, including chronic wasting disease prevalence, causes of mortality, and pregnancy and recruitment rates by chronic wasting disease status. We investigated annual survival, including both comparisons of CWD negative and CWD positive survival, as well as covariates that could have an effect on annual survival. And we used these population vital rates that we were investigating, put them into a Leslie matrix population model, and calculated lambda for this population. So this is a map showing the current distribution of chronic wasting disease in the state of Wyoming, since this is where my study took place. This map has regretfully filled in quite a bit since I began talking about chronic wasting disease several years ago. Maybe 80% of the state is now covered in what's considered CWD endemic areas. Initially, CWD was found down in southeastern Wyoming and has spread north and northwest into the west. I'd like to thank the Wyoming Game and Fish Department for providing me access to this map. My study took place in southeastern Wyoming, right here in what's considered the historic endemic area of Wyoming. We captured deer on Deer Creek Drainage, which is a tributary of the North Platte River, east of Casper, Wyoming, and southwest of Glen Rock. You may have heard of Casper. It's one of 2 major cities in the state. Deer Creek has several tributaries where we captured deer. Deer in Rocky Mountain West, and I'll explain this in greater detail later, but they really rely on the riparian areas for the vast majority of their life. They find food, cover, water in the riparian areas, and they use the adjacent alfalfa fields. But other than that, they really don't utilize the landscape. We captured deer, our study design was to capture animals as fawns around 8 months old in the wintertime. We captured deer, we tested them for chronic wasting disease, and then we marked them with either a VHF radio transmitter, or later in the study we marked all of our animals with global positioning system collars. We then recaptured all deer on an annual basis to retest for CWD, download the GPS collar data, and switch out transmitters as needed. So we captured most of our fawns using clover traps, which is the box trap to the left. And then we recaptured all of our deer using helicopter net gunning. You've already seen this picture once today in Brian's slides, But we used tonsil biopsies for our CWD testing, where we collect a small tissue sample from the tonsil, fix it in the field, and then take it back to the Wyoming State Vet Lab for immunohistochemistry testing for disease-associated prion proteins. We collected blood samples from our female deer to pregnancy test, and we used radiotelemetry and GPS collars for our survival data to determine cause of mortality. So all of our transmitters were equipped with mortality sensors, indicating to us when the animal had been inactive for more than 4 hours. This allowed us to hike into the mortality site, perform a field investigation to help determine cause of mortality, and then we also performed complete necropsies on all of our animals, as well as complete CWD testing. And then finally, we also used GPS collars and radio transmitters to document recruitment in our female deer. We did this by hiking in, bumping the female from her day bed, and then counting the number of fawns at her side in late summer. Okay, so our study period was January 2003 through February 2010. We captured 112 deer originally as fawns, and we did attempt to maintain a 50-50 sex ratio because we were interested in the ecological impacts of chronic wasting disease in bucks as well as in females. We did have a rather high attrition rate on our project, and so in order to maintain our adult sample sizes, we did have to capture an additional 63 deer as adults. And as you can see, we did capture more males than females because our bucks had lower survival rates, which I'll get into later. As I mentioned, this is a high CWD prevalence area. We had an overall CWD prevalence of 35.4%. And interestingly, we had higher prevalence in our females than our males at 42% compared to 28.9 or 28.8. And this is a unique population to have higher prevalence in females than males. And I'll get into the reason why we think that's, or at least we hypothesize why this is happening in the discussion section of this talk. Hunter harvest was the #1 cause of mortality in this population, and CWD positive deer were overrepresented in our hunter harvest, indicating that they were more likely to be shot by hunters than CWD negative deer. We also had more CWD positive deer in our total mortalities, that's this column to the right, than would be expected based on the prevalence. So in other words, CWD positive deer were more likely to be killed or to die during our study than CWD negative deer. Unfortunately, capture-related mortalities was the second most common cause of mortality. It turns out that helicopter net gunning deer on an annual basis is a rather dangerous endeavor, and unfortunately we did kill several of our study animals. And then finally, CWD was the #3 cause of mortality. I'd point out that our hunter harvest was comprised primarily of bucks. 76% of our harvest were bucks, whereas clinical CWD comprised 71% females. So our females were living till clinical CWD, whereas our bucks seemed to be getting shot earlier in the disease course. We investigated pregnancy and recruitment by CWD status. We found that both pregnancy and recruitment did not vary by CWD status. We had really high pregnancy rates, 95 and 92% for CWD negative and CWD positive deer respectively, and these rates were not different. Our recruitment was actually fairly low, particularly for white-tailed deer, but it was 0.69 in our CWD negative deer, and it was actually higher in our CWD positive deer at 0.88, but again, these did not differ. Annual survival rates did differ by CWD status for both does and bucks. The orange line is showing CWD positive annual survival rates, and then the red line is showing CWD negative annual survival rates. And on the left is our females or our does, on the right is our bucks. Overall, we had a fairly slow, steady decline in annual survival for our females. But our bucks actually had a pretty high survival rate until the onset of the hunting season, where we had this large precipitous decline, followed by, again, a flattening out of their survival rates. So this is indicating to us that there was no time of the year that our does died more often than not, whereas in comparison, our bucks were being harvested primarily during the hunting season, and then they were surviving the rest of the year. We are also interested in determining what factors affected survival, not just whether it differed by CWD status, but was there something that could have an effect on our survival rates. We investigated several covariates using Cox proportional hazards modeling, and what we found was that CWD and sex had the greatest impact on survival. So our hazard ratio of 4.5 for CWD and a 1.7 for sex can be interpreted as the following. Our CWD positive deer died at a rate that was 4.5 times greater than that occurred in our CWD negative deer. And males died at a rate 1.7 times greater than females. Okay, so we incorporated all these population vital rates into a Leslie matrix population model, and what we determined was our lambda value equaled 0.896. This equates to a 10.4% annual decline, which is not sustainable. If you assumed a closed population, which this is not, but if you assumed that, the half-life for that population is only 5 years, and the time to extinction is only 48 years. So that 10.4% is really a serious number. We are interested in determining why this population was declining, not just that it is declining. And so we used post hoc tests to indicate that the declines were caused directly by chronic wasting disease, and chronic wasting disease was causing these population declines by lowering the survival of our young female deer. So that age cohort of 1.5 and 2.5 years old, which are prime age for reproduction, a vast majority of them, or not a vast majority, but a large percentage of them are dying due to chronic wasting disease. And so you can see that if a large segment of your population that should be adding fawns to the population is dying due to a disease, why this population would be declining. We also were interested to determine what effect hunting was having on this population, since it was the #1 cause of mortality, and around 25% of the hunter-harvest are does. So we recalculated the survival probability with female hunter-harvest removed or censored from the survival analysis. We then held all other vital rates the same and recalculated lambda, and what we found was that the resulting population was actually stable. So if you removed hunting from this situation, or at least female hunting from this population, we would have a stable population. But the combination of hunting plus CWD resulted in the declining population. We also were interested to determine at what point we would expect this tipping from an increasing or stable population to a declining population. So we varied our lambda values across several prevalences, and we determined that at 27%, at least in the Rocky Mountain West, we would expect white-tailed deer populations to become unstable, moving from lambda values greater than 1 to lambda values less than 1 at 27%. And in comparison, our study, if you recall, is at 35%, so they've been declining for quite some time. Okay, so in conclusion, CWD positive deer were 4.5 times less likely to survive than CWD negative deer. We also found that CWD did not affect reproduction in this population. And we believe that populations will enter into this unsustainable stage, or these lambda values less than 1, when CWD prevalence exceeds around 27%. And again, for reference, our study population was at 35%. And finally, CWD positive deer were more likely to be harvested in this population than CWD negative deer. So for our study, we didn't just look at population-level impacts of chronic wasting disease. We also studied the ecology of white-tailed deer in relation to chronic wasting disease. And in order to frame some of the conclusions from the population impact side, I need to explain a couple of our ecological findings as well. So I'd like to point out that fewer CWD-positive females migrated than CWD-positive males. So the CWD-positive males, 35% of them migrated compared to only 7% of our CWD-positive females. And those males, interestingly, we think could be playing a role in spreading the disease between disparate populations due to the pretty high migration rate. Whereas the females are staying put. They're relatively sedentary. Also, our CWD-negative females occupied significantly larger home ranges than CWD-positive females. And in fact, the CWD-positive females occupied the smallest home ranges of any other cohort on the landscape. So not only are they not migrating, but they're also occupying really small areas, less than 1 square kilometer on average throughout the year. And then finally, as I mentioned during my study area description, the deer we're selecting for riparian areas. So all deer, regardless of CWD status, sex, or migratory status, we're selecting strongly for riparian areas. So you can picture this in this situation where our CWD positive females are not migrating, they're staying put, they're occupying really small areas, and those areas are all found in our riparian corridor. So why do I mention this? Well, because we believe that their habitat use of these riparian areas may explain why we have higher prevalence in our females along with the hunter harvest. So as I mentioned, 76% of the harvest were bucks. 71% of our clinical cases were our CWD positive clinical cases were females. We also found that females lived longer after contracting chronic wasting disease than our bucks did, on average almost 7 or 8 months longer. So we have this situation where females are remaining on the landscape for a longer period of time, they're reaching clinical CWD, they have the potential to spread the disease to their female cohorts and to contaminate that environment that's concentrated in these riparian areas throughout their lifespan. So you can envision this vicious cycle that occurs where between direct transmission to their female cohorts as well as environmental contamination, we have this situation where the prevalence in females increases beyond that of our bucks, which are being removed earlier during disease progression due to hunter harvest. And they're not having as much time to spread the disease to their male cohorts. Now, just something to think about, we wonder if this is an indicator of things to come in other areas. As I mentioned, this is the only population we know of that has this higher prevalence in females than males. We wonder if through time, as environmental contamination becomes more and more common, say in winter concentration areas in the upper Midwest, if this same scenario could play out where environmental contamination can lead to higher prevalence in females as well. Just something to ponder. So CWD caused population declines by reducing the survival of young females. And as I mentioned, this is a kind of a worst case scenario for this population because a high proportion of the population drivers are CWD positive. Females are what drives ungulate populations, as you all in this room know. And with that higher prevalence in our females than males, this is why we have this situation of a nearly 10.5% annual decline. And finally, our lambda estimate of 0.896 was the lowest reported for CWD endemic populations at the time of our publication. As Brian pointed out, Malia DeVivo shortly thereafter published a paper with an even lower lambda value. But all other reported lambda estimates have overlapped 1, which indicates that they're not statistically significant. So this is the first time that we have proof that CWD can cause population declines in a high CWD prevalence population. So Brian stole a little bit of the thunder on this slide, unfortunately, but that's okay. I'm still going to reiterate the fact that Malia DeVivo, who was a graduate student of Todd Cornish, investigated population declines in mule deer, in a sympatric mule deer herd that's located in the same deer hunt area in Wyoming. And what she found was that lambda value was 0.79, which equated to a 21% annual population decline. I would suggest that this is lower in mule deer due to the fact that they have lower reproductive potential compared to white-tailed deer, although that's just conjecture. She also found that pregnancy and recruitment rates were not affected by CWD. And she found that in the absence of chronic wasting disease, lambda was actually stable, not increasing though. So mule deer, there's still something going on in mule deer populations that's causing that population not to increase, even in the absence of CWD. Okay, so what are the management implications of our research? Well, I would argue that when we have a population that's declining at 10.5%, and the fact that we don't have an adequate management strategy to get rid of chronic wasting disease once it's endemic, we should be concerned with, are we actually going to have deer on the landscape? And so if the goal is to maintain deer populations in these high prevalence areas, we should be eliminating female harvest. This, at least in this population, this would equate to a lambda value of 1.0, or at least maintain a stable population. Now, there's certainly complications, and this isn't a good long-term strategy, because prevalence is likely to increase even greater with leaving even more females on the landscape, therefore potentially lowering lambda eventually anyway. But in the short term, it's something to consider. As Brian pointed out, there's currently no adequate vaccine, there's no treatment, and to date, once CWD is endemic, there is no management options to actually lower prevalence that we know of at this point. And so, at this point, our best management strategy are effective regulations to prevent the spread of CWD to new areas. I'm sure plenty of people will be discussing options for this throughout the day. Okay, with that, I'd like to point out that the Morris Animal Foundation helped fund this research, along with several other partners, including the U.S. Geological Survey, the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, the Wyoming Wildlife and Livestock Disease Research Partnership, and Whitetails Unlimited. Several people in Wyoming assisted with this research. I'd like to acknowledge them and thank them for their assistance. And also, in Wyoming, it's not possible to do whitetail research without private landowner participation. So I'd like to thank the landowners, particularly the True family, for allowing us access to their ranch. And with that, I was going to take questions, but it sounds like we're going to hold off. So thank you for your attention.